Before the night Michael Carter's truck broke down. Before he stumbled into St. Mark's Orphanage. There was another story. One buried in whispers and forgotten faces. The story of 6 children who had already seen more loss in 2 years than most would in a lifetime. The winter air bit through the cracks of a small apartment on Alder Street. Inside, a young woman named Angela Brooks, barely 22, sat huddled beneath a threadbare blanket. Her eyes were swollen from tears, her hands trembling as she cradled a baby, one of 6. Angela had once dreamed of better things. A nursing student, bright and full of promise. She'd fallen for a man who promised her the world. Instead, he gave her heartbreak and 6 mouths to feed before she was even ready to care for one. Her name would never make the papers, but her love for her children burned brighter than anyone knew. There was Daniel, the firstborn, quiet even as a baby, always watching, eyes curious and full of questions. Ethan, who came next, loud and fearless, kicking and crying as if announcing to the world he would never be ignored. Caleb, the mischievous one, whose giggles could melt even Angela's darkest moods. Jonah, smaller than the rest, fragile but fierce, always clinging to his mother's shirt as though afraid the world would take her away. Samuel, the peacemaker, whose laughter seemed to chase away the cold. And finally, Grace, the only girl, born just minutes after her brothers. Her tiny fists already clenched as if she came into the world ready to fight. Angela loved them, but love couldn't fill their stomachs. Days blurred into nights. Angela worked long hours at a laundromat, leaving the babies in the care of an elderly neighbor. When she came home, she'd collapse on the floor beside their cribs, too exhausted to eat, whispering lullabies through cracked lips. Bills piled up. The landlord's patience ran out. And the children, barely 1 year old, grew thinner, quieter except Grace, who cried the loudest when hunger set in. One freezing evening, Angela found herself standing in the kitchen, the last can of formula empty. The power had been cut, and the shadows loomed long. She pressed all 6 of them close, tears streaming down her face. "Mama's so sorry," she whispered. "I tried." When dawn came, she wrapped each baby in a single brown blanket, identical to the next, a gift from the church down the street. She kissed each forehead, murmured their names, and prayed. Then, as the snow began to fall, she carried them, one by one, to St. Mark's Orphanage, a place she'd passed countless times, never thinking it would be their last home together. She left them at the steps with a letter, but the wind took it before the nuns found the children. All that remained were 6 brown blankets, and the echo of a mother's goodbye. St. Mark's was no stranger to abandonment. Its halls had seen infants, toddlers, even teenagers left behind when life became too heavy. But 6 at once. Identical blankets, matching eyes, was something even Sister Anne, who had served 40 years, had never seen. The nuns took them in, naming them the 6. They became the talk of the town for a few days. Reporters snapped photos, churches donated food, and curious visitors peeked in to see the miracle 6. But soon the headlines faded, and so did the attention. By the time the babies turned 2, St. Mark's was struggling. Donations had slowed. Staff were overworked. The infants' laughter was replaced by the shuffle of tiny feet down cold hallways. Daniel often sat by the window, watching the snow, his wide eyes tracking the cars that never stopped. Ethan climbed everything he could, chairs, tables, even the bunk beds, earning himself a permanent bruise on his forehead. Caleb smeared chalk drawings on the orphanage walls. Jonah followed the nurses everywhere, asking, "Where's Mama?" until they stopped answering. Samuel shared his toys, even when he barely had any. And Grace, fierce, protective Grace, would pull her brothers close whenever another child tried to take something from them. Even at 2 years old, she understood the meaning of family. Adoption days came and went. Families arrived, cooing over the children, but they always looked past the 6. "Too many," they'd whisper. "We can't take all of them. Maybe just 1 or 2? But when the nuns suggested separating them, the children would cry until they lost their voices. Grace would scream. Jonah would cling to Ethan. Even Daniel, calm as he was, would shake his head and say no. So the years passed. Every birthday, the nuns placed 6 small cakes on the table, unevenly frosted, but enough to make the children smile. Every Christmas, they sat in a row by the orphanage door, watching the other children leave with new parents, clutching new coats and stuffed animals. And every night, before bed, they held hands, a silent promise that they would never be apart. By the fall of 1991, the orphanage roof leaked, and Sister Anne was now too old to climb the stairs. The children, 5 boys and 1 girl, had just turned 2. That night, thunder cracked across the sky. Rain poured in heavy sheets, soaking the old shingles. The children were restless, crying, calling out, afraid of the storm. Grace huddled between her brothers on a worn mat, whispering the way she'd seen Sister and pray. In the hallway, a tired nurse named Margaret sighed as she checked on them. 6 babies and no family, she murmured. How could the world forget? Then, through the roar of the storm, came the sound of a truck engine sputtering outside. Headlights flashed through the rain. And fate, as if remembering the promise Angela once whispered into the snow, guided Michael Carter to St. Mark's Orphanage. He stepped inside, soaked to the bone, looking for help with his broken truck. But what he found instead changed everything. In that small, dimly lit room, the 6 children sat huddled together, trembling. Michael stopped in the doorway, frozen. He saw their wide eyes, their matching blankets, the way they clung to one another, not with fear, but with the quiet understanding of survival. For a moment he didn't breathe. He thought of Laura, of her last words, whispered through fading breath. Don't let love die with me. Give it somewhere to go. Something deep in his chest shifted. As he knelt down, Daniel tilted his head curiously. Ethan crawled forward without fear. Jonah's small hand reached for his sleeve. Grace, tiny and fierce, stared straight into his eyes as if to ask, "Will you leave us too?" And in that instant, the silence that had filled Michael's life broke. The next morning, paperwork filled his kitchen table. Friends called him insane. His sister begged him to think twice. But Michael had already decided. He sold his truck, pawned his tools, and emptied his savings. Within weeks, the 6 children who had been forgotten were home, his home. He gave them names, warmth, and the one thing they had never known, belonging. Daniel, Ethan, Caleb, Jonah, Samuel, Grace, the Carter 6. The children no one wanted, finally, no longer forgotten. Years later, when people saw the family in photographs, the white man surrounded by 6 black children, smiling through every storm, they wondered where their story began. It began here, with a young mother's last prayer, a stormy night, and a man who refused to let love die. In 1991, he adopted 6 children no one wanted. But before that night, this was their story. Watch the full story. In 1991, he adopted 6 children no one wanted. See them now. Subscribe to Tales by Nanya for more true life stories of love and second chances.